Hello, I'm Pastor Paul. Welcome to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. We're glad you're here. We know that you can't always be in worship with us, so we're glad to provide the sermons from our weekly services. We hope that you will find hope and inspiration as we have in Jesus Christ. And now, here's this week's message. The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 4th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus stills a storm. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. So we've had a few storms lately, right? And not some of those really big storms like Iowa can churn up in the hot summer days that we get, but enough to remind my lovely wife, hi honey, that it was time to stock the basement with some food and water and emergency supplies. I remember as a child watching big storms blow in and marveling at the energy that they produced. Then at the first big crack of lightning, I would go running to my mom and dad, right? Today's message is Jesus is with us through the storms of life. Jesus is with us through the storms of life. The first part of Mark's gospel is a seaside story. There are references to Jesus walking beside, crossing, or approaching the sea in each of the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. In today's gospel, we know that Jesus has been teaching from a boat offshore to avoid being crushed by the crowd. And now we learn that Jesus is sleeping on a boat with his disciples as a big storm batters the boat and its occupants. Now, first of all, I don't know if I could be sleeping in a boat when there was a big storm. Jesus gets called into action by his disciples. His presence with them is not enough. Yet they fail to trust. And their lack of faith leads Jesus to say 3 simple words. Peace, be still. And the wind and the water are calmed. Mark's gospel wants to make sure we know that the disciples are not perfect. They are, in many ways, regular people who stumble through their experience of faith with Jesus. He also wants us to know that Jesus is with the disciples through the storms in their lives. They encounter this storm on the way across the sea to visit a foreign place, a place filled with Gentiles, that is, outsiders to the Jewish people. It shouldn't surprise us that they are going. After all, Jesus crosses many social and spiritual boundaries in his ministry. He eats with unsuitable people, breaks Sabbath law, associates with the unclean, and heals at entirely the wrong time. And he communicates with unclean spirits. Do you remember these gospel readings we've had so far this year? And so for the disciples, crossing to the other side with Jesus may be a risky and unpredictable proposition. So this text is about faith, or maybe a lack of it, and about Jesus' presence with the disciples in the midst of the storms of life. It's also about our faith, or lack of it, and about Jesus' presence with us through the storms of life. We've each lived through some storms in our lives, haven't we? What have been yours? What are the storms that you've experienced? What storms are you in the middle of right now? The storms of life for young adults these days involve vocation, knowing what the right job will be, knowing that it's likely that they'll have many jobs in their life. They won't get one job and work for a company for 40 years and retire. and living with the angst of deciding what to study in college. How many young people have gone in, gotten a degree, and ended up doing something completely unrelated to the degree? Which internship to take, where to live, who to date, who to marry. Not to mention all the normal issues that come along with just being a young adult. Some of you are parents. You will weather a new storm whose epicenter will be an empty place at the table or an unused bedroom. And you'll wonder if you taught your children well enough to go out and make it on their own. For many retirees, the storm looks like survival in a time when health care is harder to get and more expensive. The storm can look like the stock market and retirement investments and wondering whether they will hold out over the coming years and what the future will hold. Storms can look like sickness, family problems, frailty, cancer, loneliness. The boats we are in may be rocking out of control. Perhaps they're even being swamped by the crashing waves. And we cry out, Jesus! Can't you see that I'm perishing? Do you care? I was reminded by a friend this week who shared that it's been 3 years ago this week that a man entered a church in Charleston and shot several innocent people. In my work for Churchwide, I made a trip to South Carolina shortly after, and I sat with those who were friends of the people slain during the church Bible study. I listened to their stories of tragic loss as a community and what it meant even to their state. Like a hurricane that blows on shore in waves, sadly, the Charleston shootings are but one example of the racial violence in our country. I remember watching, as perhaps you did, as survivors and surviving family members spoke words of forgiveness to the shooter during his arraignment hearing. I also heard of prayer services that spread across the country. There were even prayer services at the Lutheran Center where I worked. Lutherans, African Methodist, Episcopals, and many other denominations gathering together to pray. The storms blew, but Jesus stands with God's people in the midst of the storms and calls to us, to you and to me, not to continue with the status quo of injustice and inequality. Jesus is with us through the storms of life. I read another Facebook post from a former neighbor in Iowa who lost a young friend who was like a daughter to her, to the senseless violence of a disturbed man. She wrote after the sentencing of this man to life in prison that she prayed for the forgiveness of this killer and that she didn't hope for his death or eternal damnation, but that he would come to know the love of God in Christ Jesus and turn his life around and find meaning even in prison. I read it and I wondered to myself, what kind of faith is required to speak forgiveness in the face of such tragedies? And it's clear to me that Jesus stands with people like my friend through the storms of life. This week I followed the stories of the separation of children from their parents at the border. First, I can't imagine someone taking my child from me and placing them in a holding center, and I can't imagine the kind of pain and suffering that must have accompanied these families in their home countries to lead them to flee for their lives. But in this awfulness, I also saw hope in the many people, churches, and governing bodies that stood up for the least of these. I even learned of a fundraiser yesterday that received $13 million to help families work through the legal process to gain citizenship. Jesus is with these families in the storms of their lives. I want you to know that Jesus is in the boat with you today. If you are experiencing pain, suffering, or sickness, if you are lonely or unhappy, if you need to forgive someone who's hurt you, if you need the courage to speak out against injustice and inequity where you see it happening, Jesus is present in your boat as you cross through that storm. I used to love to sailboard. I used to love to watch sailboats on the Gulf of Mexico. One thing I learned from my experience of sailboarding is that A, I can't do it well, but B, that a sailboat or a sailboard without wind is a rowboat. In sailboarding, when the wind suddenly dies, you go nowhere without a heck of a lot of paddling. Jesus can calm the storm, but we have to be willing to row the boat to get to the other side. Jesus can calm the storm, but we have to be willing to row the boat. While we may pray that Jesus would work miracles in our lives and in our world and in our neighborhoods, the miracles that come probably won't let us off the hook from doing something, some hard work that will be required in response to what Jesus calls us to. If you are in a good place, your life is whole. Everything is coming up roses. First of all, thank God. And good for you. Then ask how you might climb in the boat with someone else to help them along the way. Even though we know the end of the story, unlike the disciples in the boat with Jesus that day, we still struggle to respond to Jesus' question about faith, don't we? When we trust in God's embrace and God with our faith, we find that we are in a position to experience the stilling of our storms, the restoration of our broken and marginalized, and the transformation from death to life. We're not promised that there will be no storms in our lives, but we are promised that Jesus will be with us. Perhaps Jesus' command wasn't spoken just to wind and waves, but to us. Jesus invites us into the awareness that he rests amid the storm. Love abides beneath the noise and anxieties of the day. Love abides and breathes into us. Peace, be still.
Thanks for listening to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. If you're ever in the Dubuque-Land area, please join us for worship. Visit our website at www.lordoflife.online to learn more about service times and about our vision for serving God and our community. God bless you.